"Hey, Julia, are you still coming to dinner tonight?" asked Nicole over the phone, her voice crackling slightly on the line. Julia sighed, glancing out the window of her small, tastefully furnished apartment in downtown Seattle. She had once lived in a sprawling mansion in the affluent suburb of Medina, Washington, but her new life was simpler, more modest. She liked to believe it was more honest, too. "Yeah, I'm coming," Julia replied, tugging nervously at the sleeve of her blouse. "I could use some girl time. It's been a rough couple of weeks." After hanging up, she gazed at her reflection in a nearby mirror. She was 32, with soft brown hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that once sparkled with unbridled optimism. Now, they revealed the heartbreak she was trying so hard to mask. Memories of her ex-husband, Ethan Harrington, never seemed to fade. Even after she had moved into her own place and changed her life drastically, fragments of their relationship still haunted her dreams. It was only a year ago that she had stood in Ethan's penthouse suite, tears streaming down her face as she confronted him for the last time. She could still recall his smirk, the slight curl of his lip as he brushed off her complaints about the constant teasing and his dismissive attitude. She walked away from that life of luxury because her self-worth mattered more than brand-new sports cars and designer jewelry. With a deep breath, Julia decided she wouldn't let the past ruin her chance at happiness tonight. She pulled on a smart jacket and headed out, hailing a cab toward Nicole's favorite restaurant, a casual bistro near the bustling Pike Place market. "Julia, over here." Nicole waved from a table at the back, where the warm lighting created a comforting glow around the small group of friends. Nicole was an old college friend who knew everything about Julia's journey, from starry-eyed newlywed to heartbroken divorcee, and now, to cautious single woman in search of stability. As Julia slid into her seat, she offered half a smile. "Thanks for inviting me. I almost backed out tonight." Nicole leaned in. "Don't you dare. You need a distraction, and that's what we're here for. By the way, I invited someone else." She motioned to the man seated next to her. "Julia, meet Brandon," said Nicole, her eyes lighting up. "He's a friend of mine from work. He just moved here from Chicago." Brandon wore a charcoal gray sweater and had kind hazel eyes. He offered a friendly smile, slightly adjusting his position in his wheelchair. Julia immediately noticed the ease with which he maneuvered it, as though the chair was an extension of his body. There was a gentle aura about him that piqued her curiosity. "Nice to meet you," Brandon said, extending his hand. "Nicole has told me a lot about you. Says you're an amazing cook and a sharp business mind." Julia blushed, surprised that Nicole had spoken so favorably. "I don't know about that, but I do whip up a pretty good lasagna." As the evening went on, Julia found herself unexpectedly comfortable in Brandon's presence. They laughed over stories of Nicole's college antics, shared tastes in music, both loved acoustic folk and older jazz, and discovered an odd mutual obsession with coffee tasting. Outside, the Seattle rain drummed against the window, but inside that cozy bistro, a strange warmth flowed through Julia's heart. She couldn't deny it. There was something calming about Brandon, a softness in his eyes that made her feel safe. His wheelchair, surprisingly, didn't faze her. If anything, it added to her admiration. He seemed so confident and content despite his physical limitation. By the time she returned home, she felt a flicker of hope she hadn't experienced in a long time. Could Brandon be the person to restore her faith and love? Sleep came quickly, but not before her thoughts lingered on the man whose gentle voice and genuine compliments had breathed life into her weary soul. Julia woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached over, still groggy, and saw Ethan's name on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat. She let it ring until it went to voicemail. There was no part of her that wanted to talk to Ethan first thing in the morning. Not after what she went through to escape his world. A year prior, Ethan Harrington was the talk of every financial publication in the country. He had successfully launched his tech startup, Skywave Innovations, turning it into a multi-billion-dollar empire seemingly overnight. When Julia first met him, he was an ambitious computer engineer with a brilliant mind. His success grew at a pace that took them both by surprise. So did his ego. She remembered how, at the height of his success, Ethan would throw lavish parties at their Medina mansion, inviting celebrities and business tycoons. Julia, once excited to meet new people and share in his success, gradually retreated from that glamorous life. Ethan's attitude changed as his bank account soared. He often belittled her in front of his powerful associates, making jokes at her expense. "You can't take a joke?" he would say when she confronted him. "You know how to dish it out, but you can't handle it when it's aimed at you." His words cut her deeply, eroding her self-esteem. Shaking off the memory, Julia crawled out of bed and made her usual cup of black coffee. She needed to focus on the present, on the encouraging conversation with Brandon the night before, on the possibility of forging a new path. Her phone beeped again, signaling a text message from Ethan. She groaned. It read, "We need to talk. Call me." She ignored it, sipping her coffee in silence. She was done with Ethan's demands. If it wasn't about finalizing some random financial detail or a leftover legal form from the divorce, she had no interest. Yet her mind drifted to him occasionally, remembering the handful of beautiful moments they once shared. Her wedding day to Ethan had been, at the time, the happiest moment of her life. She had never felt more cherished until his criticisms began to overshadow any kindness he offered. Still, guilt gnawed at her for ignoring him. They had built a life together, and while they were no longer a couple, part of her felt an odd sense of loyalty. But that feeling clashed with the pain of his humiliating remarks and mocking tone. That afternoon, Julia went to meet Nicole for lunch at a chic cafe near Pioneer Square. Seattle's perpetual drizzle misted the streets, but she tried to remain upbeat. "Hey, how's my favorite soon-to-be chef?" Nicole teased, hugging her. "Still thinking about that new cooking channel idea?" Julia shrugged. "I'm not sure, but I do think I'd like to do something creative for a living. That software job drained me." Nicole nodded sympathetically. She had watched Julia endure Ethan's world, which felt increasingly stifling. "So, about last night," Nicole began, a playful spark in her eyes. "Brandon seemed really into you. He asked for your number." Julia smirked shyly, stirring her latte. "I like talking with him. He's refreshing. But, I'm still scarred from the whole Ethan situation." Nicole placed a hand on Julia's arm. "Just go slow. Talk to him. See how you feel. But I'm telling you, this guy is wonderful. He's in a wheelchair, yes, but he never complains. He's got a big heart and works at a nonprofit for disabled veterans." Julia felt her heart warm even more. A sense of admiration grew inside her. Maybe she was moving too fast emotionally, but there was something about Brandon that made her want to open up. Later that day, as she left the cafe, her phone buzzed again. She stiffened at the sight of Ethan's number, but this time, curiosity got the best of her. She answered. "Julia," Ethan's familiar baritone voice sounded through the speaker. "I'm in Seattle for a couple of days. I'd like to see you, just to talk." She hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," Ethan pressed. "It's important. I won't keep you long." Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him the following afternoon. He insisted on picking her up, but she declined, preferring they meet in a neutral, public place, an airy cafe near the waterfront. She tried to steady her nerves at the thought of confronting the very man who had once torn her down. The next day, Julia arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. The sky was a dull gray, and the chilly air smelled of salt from the Puget Sound. She tapped her foot anxiously until Ethan arrived. He was dressed casually, but Julia could see the air of confidence that came with his success. Even so, his usually impeccable posture seemed a little slumped, his gaze more subdued. "Julia," he greeted, settling across from her. "You look well." She nodded, fiddling with the menu to avoid his eyes. "I am well, Ethan." He clasped his hands on the table, taking a slow breath. "I know I hurt you." His voice was softer than she remembered. I've been thinking a lot about the way I treated you," my therapist said. Julia put up a hand. "Look, I appreciate any apology you might have, but I'm not here to dig up the past. I've moved on." "Why did you want to see me?" Ethan's jaw tensed momentarily. He released a sigh and nodded. "I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I really am. And, well, part of me hopes we can be friends. Or at least not enemies. I miss talking to you, even if it's not the same as before." His sincerity took her off guard. She studied him for a moment, unsure what to believe. Was this a genuine attempt at making amends, or another of his manipulations? They spoke politely for about 20 minutes, carefully skirting sensitive topics. After finishing their coffee, Ethan walked her to the entrance. He asked if they could stay in contact more regularly. Julia agreed to keep things civil but set firm boundaries. No more mocking, no more belittling. Ethan seemed to accept her conditions. That evening, Julia felt an emotional storm brewing inside her. She worried that letting Ethan back into her life, even in a marginal way, might complicate things. and she didn't want to risk her newfound peace. She also couldn't deny a pang of nostalgia for the good days they once had, long before the cracks in their relationship became canyons. Seemingly in answer to her dilemma, Brandon texted her as she was lost in thought. "Hey, Julia. It's Brandon. Had a great time talking last night. Any chance you're free tomorrow for coffee or maybe a stroll, a slow one, in my case?" His self-deprecating humor made her smile. She replied, "I'd love to. Let's meet at Pioneer Park." The next day, bright sunlight pierced through Seattle's typical gloom, transforming the city into a stunning tableau of vibrant colors and shining windows. Julia arrived at Pioneer Park, a green sanctuary with towering trees and winding paths. Brandon was there already, expertly maneuvering his wheelchair over the uneven terrain. "Fancy seeing you here," he quipped, tipping an imaginary hat. His grin was genuine, open. "Thanks for meeting me." Julia felt an immediate sense of calm near him. "I should be thanking you," she said. "It's not often I meet someone who can make me forget about everything else." Their conversation flowed naturally. Brandon explained how he worked with a nonprofit that helped disabled veterans find housing and jobs. He had never served in the military himself, but he felt driven to help those who had. He talked about losing the use of his legs after a car accident 3 years prior. Some reckless driver had blown a red light and hit him as he walked across a street in downtown Chicago. The recovery was grueling, he said, but it taught him resilience. "So, you never gave up hope?" Julia asked. He shook his head. "I had dark days, of course. But eventually I realized I still had my mind, my sense of humor, and the will to keep going. That was enough." Julia found herself falling for him, not just because of his courage, but because of how he radiated warmth. They spent hours strolling and rolling, as Brandon joked, talking about everything from politics to their favorite ice cream flavors. By dusk, Julia felt a lightness in her soul she hadn't experienced since. She couldn't even remember when. As they parted ways, Brandon lightly touched her hand. "Can I see you again soon?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. She smiled. "Yes, absolutely." The weeks that followed unfolded like a gentle dream. They visited museums, tried little diners and coffee shops all over Seattle, and spent long evenings talking about their pasts and hopes for the future. Brandon's wheelchair was never a barrier to their adventures. If anything, it brought them closer. Julia's compassion for him grew into admiration, and admiration slowly blossomed into love. Nicole saw the change in Julia's demeanor. "Girl, you're practically glowing," she teased one evening. "When are we going to meet this guy again?" Julia laughed. "Soon. Maybe we can do a group dinner. I just don't want to rush anything." But Brandon had plans of his own. One crisp afternoon, he took Julia to a hidden garden near the outskirts of the city, a place with cobblestone paths and trickling fountains. Beneath the canopy of trees, Brandon surprised her by pulling out a small box. "Julia," he began, his voice trembling ever so slightly, "I know it's only been a few months. But when you know, you know. You've brought life back into me, and I can't imagine a day without you. Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, elegant, and unassuming, everything Julia had learned to value. Overcome with emotion, she nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Her life had taken a sharp turn from lavish mansion to modest apartment, and now she stood on the threshold of a new journey, hand in hand with a man who seemed to love her genuinely. She imagined the wedding would be small, a heartfelt ceremony attended by a few close friends. No airs, no extravagance. Just real love, or so she believed. A warm June breeze blew through the gardens of the historic Willamette Estate in Oregon, where Julia and Brandon's wedding was set to take place. Nicole bustled about, helping the small group of family and friends get seated. Julia had always dreamed of a simple outdoor ceremony, and the orchard behind the estate provided the perfect setting. White chairs formed neat rows along the manicured lawn, and a small arch decorated with soft pink roses stood at the front. Julia peeked from behind a vine-covered column, heart racing. She wore a modest yet elegant gown with lace sleeves, her hair loosely pinned up. She couldn't recall ever being so nervous. Her thoughts drifted to Brandon, likely waiting at the arch with his wheelchair carefully adorned in subtle floral arrangements. She found the detail heartwarming. He wanted to ensure his chair fit the occasion as well. "I have to say, you look breathtaking," Nicole whispered as she adjusted Julia's train. "I'm so happy for you." Julia forced a smile. "I'm happy too. I never thought I'd be here after all that happened with Ethan. But Brandon's changed my life. Nicole gave her a quick hug. Don't think about Ethan. Focus on the man who's waiting for you. But as soon as the words left Nicole's mouth, a commotion erupted near the entry gate. The wedding guests turned their heads in unison. Julia and Nicole craned their necks to see what was happening. Her heart dropped at the sight of a sleek black Mercedes pulling onto the gravel drive. Out stepped Ethan Harrington, looking polished in a tailored suit. He strode forward with determined steps. Oh no, Julia breathed, her mouth going dry. She had not invited Ethan. She hadn't even told him about the wedding. Or had he found out through mutual acquaintances? Ethan marched toward the small group of guests, ignoring curious stares. When he spotted Nicole, he demanded, "Where's Julia? I need to talk to her." "Ethan, you can't be here," Nicole insisted, trying to block his path. "This is her wedding day. Don't cause a scene." He brushed past Nicole, ignoring the looks of shock and indignation from those seated. Julia stepped forward, her pulse hammering. She felt a mixture of anger and confusion swirl inside her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, breath catching in her throat. Ethan's usually composed face was flushed. "I can't let you go through with this, Julia. I have information you need to know before you make the biggest mistake of your life." Julia's mind raced. She signaled to the wedding officiant to pause, then led Ethan away from the seated guests for a semblance of privacy. "You have no right to barge in here," she snapped. "I don't care what you think." Ethan's expression was grim, and he held up his phone. "I hired a private investigator when I found out you were seeing Brandon Mitchell. I know it sounds extreme, but I had to be sure you weren't making a huge mistake. And I've uncovered proof that he's lying about his disability." Julia's eyes widened. "That's insane. He was in a car accident. He can't walk." Ethan shook his head, tapping his phone. "Look at these videos. They were taken just last week. Brandon is seen walking, no wheelchair in sight." Julia felt her stomach clench, her hand trembling as she took the phone. There, in shaky but clear footage, was Brandon stepping out of a small car, walking around the side, and then folding a wheelchair to place it in the trunk. He moved swiftly, with no signs of a limp or discomfort. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Could there be some reasonable explanation? This can't be right," she whispered, tears burning in her eyes. "Maybe he's undergoing therapy. Maybe he just regained some mobility recently." Ethan's gaze softened momentarily. "Julia, I wouldn't lie to you about this. The investigator found medical records. Brandon Mitchell never had a permanent spinal injury. He was treated for minor fractures after an accident. Yes, but he's fully able-bodied. He's been scamming people for donations through that veterans nonprofit. All the money goes into his private accounts." A thunderous ringing filled Julia's ears. She could barely absorb the words. "No, I can't believe this." She looked toward the arch where Brandon was waiting. He wore a calm smile that now felt eerily deceptive. Nicole hurried to them, eyes flicking between Ethan and Julia. "What's going on?" "The guests are getting restless." Julia tried to steady her trembling lips. "Nicole, I need a moment with Brandon. Alone. Please help keep the guests in their seats." She turned to Ethan. "Stay out of sight for now," she demanded. "I need to hear what Brandon has to say." Ethan nodded grimly, stepping aside. With shaky steps, Julia approached Brandon. He reached for her hand, concern etching his features. "What's wrong, my love? You look pale." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Ethan showed up, and he claims that you're not really disabled. That you can walk perfectly fine." Brandon's eyes flickered, a brief crack in his polished composure. "He's lying," he began. "He's trying to sabotage us." Julia's voice wavered. "He has videos, Brandon, of you walking. Care to explain?" For the briefest of moments, Brandon's face contorted with anger, then he pressed his lips into a forced calm. "Julia, I can explain everything. Please, you have to trust me." "Then explain," she hissed, tears brimming. Brandon's shoulders slumped. "I wanted to tell you. I have a partial paralysis that comes and goes. My doctors say it's psychosomatic. Sometimes I can stand or walk short distances, but most days I rely on the chair. I didn't want to burden you with hope that might not pan out. I was going to tell you after the wedding." Julia stared at him. "What about Ethan's claim that you're scamming donors?" Brandon glanced away, fiddling with the ring that hung on a chain around his neck. "That's nonsense. Everything I do with the nonprofit is legitimate." He's twisting facts. But as he spoke, the tension in his voice suggested cracks in the story. Julia recalled fleeting instances that hadn't quite added up. A nurse's slip of the tongue during one of his doctor's appointments, the time she thought she heard him walking around the house late at night. She had dismissed these observations, trusting him implicitly. Now, every discrepancy roared back to her consciousness. Brandon, I need the truth, she said quietly, voice threatening to break. No more half answers. He averted his gaze. Fine. I never said I was completely paralyzed. People assume it, and I don't correct them. As for the nonprofit, yes, I get a cut from it, but it's for my work. I'm allowed a salary. You told me you worked for free, Julia countered, tears now streaming. That you did it from the goodness of your heart. He gritted his teeth. I said a lot of things. Behind them, the guests began to murmur, craning their necks. Nicole hovered anxiously nearby, unsure if she should intervene. Julia fought the urge to run away or to collapse in despair. This day, which was supposed to be about celebration and hope, had shattered into 1,000 pieces of betrayal and confusion. Ethan reappeared, phone in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. Julia, I'm sorry it had to come out this way, but you needed to know. Brandon's eyes flickered with fury. You had no right to interfere. You destroyed what should have been our special day. Ethan glared back. You think you can trick someone I care about? You messed with the wrong people. Julia took a step back, feeling suffocated. She didn't even know where to direct her anger, at Ethan for storming in or at Brandon for weaving a false narrative around his disability and finances. In the end, the pain was too much. She turned to the officiant and quietly said, I'm so sorry. We can't continue. A hush fell over the gathering. The officiant frowned sympathetically, and Nicole looked on with tears brimming in her eyes. Brandon tried to grab Julia's hand, but she pulled away, shaking her head. I can't, Brandon. I don't know what's true and what's a lie anymore. With that, she stormed off toward the manor house, her wedding gown rustling in the warm afternoon breeze. The sun, once bright and promising, felt harsh against her tear-streaked face. Julia locked herself in a small sitting room inside the manor. The vintage furniture and floral wallpaper blurred as she collapsed onto a velvet sofa, heaving sobs. She felt the weight of betrayal pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. A soft knock at the door broke through the haze. She sat up, bracing herself. Who is it? She managed. It's Ethan. Part of her wanted to scream at him to go away, but she couldn't muster the energy. Come in, she whispered, swiping at her tear-stained cheeks. Ethan opened the door slowly, stepping in with measured caution. He closed it behind him and approached her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, genuine concern. Slowly, he lowered himself into a chair across from her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Julia, he began, his voice quiet, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't want you to get married under false pretenses. She inhaled a shaky breath. You had no right, she said, though her tone was more weary than accusatory. You ambushed me, Ethan, on my wedding day. He nodded in acknowledgement. I know it was the worst timing possible, but when I found out Brandon was scamming you, I couldn't let you go through with it. I tried to talk to you before, but you never answered my calls. I finally had to do something drastic. Julia's head ached with confusion. The anger and betrayal swirled inside her. But beneath it all, some part of her recognized that Ethan might have saved her from a larger heartbreak down the line. She wiped her eyes again, voice shaking. What do I do now? Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Go home. Take time to process what happened. Don't let him manipulate you anymore. You deserve better. Her breath hitched, memories of his mocking jibes and humiliation surfacing. Didn't you once say the same about me? That I deserved better, but you never treated me like I was worth it. A flash of regret crossed Ethan's face. I can't change the past, but I want to at least protect you from being hurt again. The tension in the air was thick, a heavy silence enveloping them until she finally found her voice. I need space, she said. I can't sort through this right now. My entire life just flipped upside down. Ethan nodded. I'll give you space. Then, with a hesitant softness, he added, but if you need help, if you need anything, I'm here. With that, he stood and walked out, leaving her alone once more. She crumpled back onto the sofa, hugging her arms around herself. Outside, she heard the distant hum of conversation as guests gradually learned the wedding was canceled. A wave of sorrow and embarrassment washed over her, but also a strange sense of relief that she hadn't gone through with marrying someone who'd been deceiving her. Hours passed before she finally emerged. The estate had mostly cleared out, with only Nicole and a few close friends staying behind to pack away decorations. Brandon was gone, leaving no trace but a half-wilted boutonniere tossed on a chair. Nicole rushed to Julia's side, enveloping her in a tight hug. "Are you okay?" Nicole asked softly. Julia managed a wry smile. "Not really, but I will be." Over the next few days, Julia returned to her apartment in Seattle and tried to rebuild the life she'd had before Brandon came into the picture. She canceled all honeymoon arrangements, fielded concerned calls from her family, and stayed in bed longer than usual each morning. Nicole checked on her constantly, but the heartbreak ran deep. On the third day after the fiasco, Julia was cleaning her living room when she heard a knock on the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, holding a bag from her favorite takeout place. "I'm not sure if you've been eating well," he said by way of explanation. "I brought your favorite Thai." Julia took a step back, letting him in. She wasn't certain why she felt a flutter in her stomach. Maybe it was the memories of how he used to bring her green curry and jasmine tea back in the early days of their marriage, before his rise to stardom shifted their dynamic. Or maybe it was the realization that, despite everything, Ethan had shown up when she was at her lowest. They sat at her small dining table, exchanging glances between quiet bites of pad thai and sips of tea. The clock on the wall ticked softly, filling the silence. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "I know I was horrible to you," he said, voice shaking slightly. "And I can't change that. But I'm trying to be a better man now." Julia set down her fork, swallowing hard. "And how do I know this isn't just more of your smooth talk? How do I know you won't go back to mocking me or making me feel small the moment things don't go your way?" Ethan locked eyes with her, the gravity of her words settling between them. "I've spent the past year in therapy. I realized how destructive I was to you, to myself. I'm not perfect, Julia, but I want you to see that I'm trying." She studied him, noticing subtle differences. The arrogant tilt to his chin was gone, replaced by a gentler, more self-conscious demeanor. He seemed contrite, aware of the damage he'd inflicted. They talked late into the night, about old wounds and the possibility of forging a new path. Tears were shed, but an undercurrent of understanding and empathy wove through their words. By the time Ethan left, Julia felt a weight lifting from her heart, though she remained cautious. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's presence became a quiet but reassuring constant in Julia's life. He didn't push her for romantic involvement, focusing instead on being a supportive friend. He helped her contact lawyers about the canceled wedding, ensuring she wouldn't be held liable for any joint agreements Brandon might have manipulated her into signing. One evening, as they sat in her living room, an unexpected moment of closeness passed between them. She caught him gazing at her in a way that made her heart flutter. She gently placed a hand on his cheek, recalling the earlier, happier times. "Are we crazy?" she whispered. "After everything we've been through?" He shook his head, placing his hand over hers. "Maybe, but I'd rather be crazy with you than sane without you." The following Sunday, they drove out to Discovery Park, a place that used to be special to them in the early days of their marriage. Walking the forested trails and overlooking Puget Sound, they spoke about regrets, hopes, and the possibility of a second chance. While ghosts of their past still lingered, they found a renewed sense of connection. Over a late picnic lunch, Ethan reached for her hand. "Julia, I know trust doesn't come easily, especially not after all we've been through. But I don't want to lose this chance to show you that I've changed, that we can be different this time." Julia's eyes welled up with tears, a mix of fear and longing swirling in her chest. "I don't know if I'm ready to jump back into marriage, Ethan, but I want to try, to see if there's something real between us again." He nodded, gently squeezing her fingers. "That's all I ask." They shared a tender embrace under the golden afternoon light, a symbol of a tentative step toward rebuilding what once was broken. And though they both understood the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and lingering doubts, for the first time in a long while, Julia felt a spark of genuine hope. In time, her wounds from Brandon's deception would scar over, but not define her. She chose to believe that people can learn from mistakes, her own, Ethan's, and even Brandon's. The love she sought was not found in illusions or false pretenses, but in facing the hard truths and still daring to heal. And so, with Ethan by her side, she closed the door on one disastrous chapter of her life and opened another that, while uncertain, held the promise of hard-earned, honest love.